Hello, welcome to the marijuana education program, The Blunt Truth. I'm Miss Kline, a prevention specialist with the Council on Chemical Abuse. We all know that marijuana is a highly controversial topic right now, but no matter what side a person falls on, both sides agree that using marijuana in an underdeveloped brain or brain that is not fully developed is highly dangerous. Using any substances before the brain is fully developed can increase the risk of addiction and can stop healthy brain development. In the following slides, we will talk about some fact and fiction regarding marijuana, just so you know the truth. And then we'll talk about the short and long term effects of using marijuana. Okay, fact or fiction. Marijuana is harmless because it's natural, because it comes from a plant. That is fiction. What else comes from a plant? Right. Tobacco, cocaine, heroin, they all come from plants. Just because they are natural does not mean that they are harmless. All right, what do you think? Fact or fiction? Smoking marijuana weakens the immune system. That is a fact. Smoking suppresses the body's immune system. Marijuana smokers are more susceptible to illnesses and infections than non smokers. Smoking marijuana slows the heart rate so that it's relaxing. Right, that is fiction. THC, which is the psychoactive chemical in marijuana, it connects into the receptors into your brain and creates a state of euphoria. Euphoria is this extreme state of happiness. This euphoric feeling gives the person the illusion of relaxation. However, THC acts as a stimulant on the heart and increases the heart rate. An elevated heart rate will never put a person in a state of relaxation. All right, fact or fiction? Marijuana is not addictive. Yes, we all know that that is fiction. Marijuana is addicting. Whenever you feel good from natural rewards of everyday life, our body is going to release a chemical called, correct, dopamine. Dopamine um, allows us to feel good, tells us that we feel good. Dopamine also lets the person know that something is important to them. If something is important to you, you'll want to do it again. Drugs and alcohol release dopamine, but in much more quantities than the brain needs or can handle. Continuing to use a drug for some people can alter the way the brain functions, and addiction can develop. In the last lesson, when we talked about with the alcohol lesson, we discussed the stages of addiction. Dopamine is initially responsible for a person seeking out that drug. Once addiction develops, that drug hijacks the brain, and the person believes that they need the drug in order to survive. In addition, the body becomes sick when that drug depletes from the body. Marijuana releases large amounts of dopamine when used. Over time, a person can develop an addiction. People develop tolerance and experience withdrawal from using marijuana. When a person withdraws from marijuana, they may experience insomnia, that inability to sleep, irritability, lack of motivation, and mood disorders. All right, what do you think? Fact or fiction? Marijuana use makes users less motivated. That is a fact. When the body is forced to make dopamine, when a person uses drugs over time, the body is going to stop making dopamine naturally. So what that means for a person is that they will no longer be able to feel pleasure from normal things in their everyday life. The only time they will be able to feel good is when they are using that drug. When the body cannot make dopamine naturally, this causes a person to feel depressed and unmotivated. All right, fact or fiction? Marijuana bought from a dealer contains no other substances. Yes, we all know that is fiction. Marijuana dealers, drug dealers will lace the drugs with other substances, including chemicals found in bug spray, LSD, cocaine, and more recently, even fentanyl. Marijuana use suppresses the appetite. That is fiction. THC increases the appetite, causing what some people refer to as the munchies. Therefore, people often gain weight as a result of smoking. Marijuana use affects a person's ability to drive safely. Yes, we all know that is a fact. Marijuana negatively affects a driver's attentiveness, the perception of time and speed. It impairs judgment and motor coordination. These side effects can last up to 3 hours after using. Marijuana users have an increased chance of being involved in a car accident. Fact or fiction? Marijuana use can cause forgetfulness. That is a fact. THC connects to receptors in the brain that affect our memory. During the high and for weeks after, the user will have difficulty recalling information stored in that short term memory. Marijuana users have an increased risk for depression. As we talked about before with dopamine levels, that is a fact. Researchers have found that there's an association between marijuana use and an increased risk of depression and also an early onset of schizophrenia and some other psychotic disorders, especially for teens with a genetic predisposition to either condition. Right? So, meaning that if a person has a history of these types of disorders in their family, then that teen would be at a higher risk for developing those disorders as well due to using marijuana. Researchers believe that one of the reasons for this risk comes from the body not making natural dopamine production. All right. Fact or fiction? Marijuana users always know what to expect when they use the drug. Yes, that is fiction. The effects of using marijuana can be unpredictable. Marijuana can affect each person differently depending on genetics, the potency of the THC, so how much THC is actually in the marijuana the person is using, how the drug is taken, and the person's experience with the drug. So eating marijuana is totally different than if somebody was smoking it. There's a chemical in the body that's used to break down food that interacts with the THC and intensifies the high. In addition, smoking marijuana allows the drug to enter the brain in seconds. So the feeling comes on a lot quicker, that euphoria. But consuming it is very different. Marijuana has to enter the intestines, broken down, then enter the bloodstream, and eventually enter the brain. And this could take a lot longer. So the person may take a lot more because they're not feeling high. So they take a lot more, which then could lead to a person becoming very sick. Fact or fiction? Marijuana smoke is safe. Well, obviously everybody knows that that is fiction. Okay. The smoke from marijuana contains the same cancer-causing substances as tobacco. Smoking anything is dangerous for you. The only thing that should be in your lungs is correct air. All right, fact or fiction? Marijuana smoke can cause respiratory problems. That is a fact. The marijuana smoke consists of a mixture of gases and particles, many of which are harmful to the lungs. Regular smokers may have respiratory problems such as coughing, phlegm, acute chest illnesses, and a greater risk of lung infections. The same as if somebody was smoking cigarettes. Right, fact or fiction? Marijuana use while pregnant does not affect the developing fetus. That is fiction. A pregnant woman who regularly uses marijuana may give birth prematurely. Studies also suggest that prenatal use, prenatal means while they're pregnant, may result in birth defects and mental abnormalities and increased risk of leukemia in children. Marijuana use impairs short-term memory. And obviously that is a fact. As we talked about before, THC is going to connect to specific receptors in your brain. THC is going to alter how that information is processed in the hippocampus, and that is the area of the brain that is responsible for your memory formation. Fact or fiction? Marijuana use does not interfere with athletic performance. That is fiction. It does. Marijuana can affect the timing, movement, depth perception, coordination, all which can negatively affect an athletic performance. Marijuana is connecting to receptors in those parts of the brain that is responsible, for your coordination, timing, and movement. Fact or fiction? High doses of marijuana can cause psychosis and panic attacks. That is a fact. Studies show that for some users, they can experience psychotic reactions or panic attacks while under the influence. Fact or fiction? K2 or spice is safer than marijuana because it is fake weed. And obviously, that is fiction. Synthetic marijuana or fake weed is basically a poison with unpredictable side effects. They are not the same side effects that people who are smoking marijuana experience. Users usually report side effects that include like vomiting, confusion, hallucinations, extreme state of irritability. It has also been linked with heart attack and overdose and death. All right, let's go on and talk a little bit about marijuana and the brain. The scientific name for marijuana is cannabis sativa, and it's been growing naturally, like I said, on the planet since the planet has been here. That natural plant contains about 2 to 5% THC. There's over 400 compounds in marijuana, right, which are called cannabinoids. We only study two of them: THC, and that's a psychoactive property that gets people high, and then something called CBD. And I know we've all heard about CBD. We see that around now, CBD oils and things like that. CBD's job in the marijuana plant is to neutralize THC. So in the natural plant, if it's growing at 2% THC, CBD is going to be the same percent. That ratio is 1 to 1. Okay. So while a person may feel relaxed and things like that, it's not going to give them that extreme high, right? This is not the same plant we have. The plant that people are using now has been genetically modified and altered. They have continued to increase the THC, but left the CBD level alone. Okay. So as you can see on this next slide, starting in the mid 90s, okay, they started to increase the THC levels, right? And they have rose steadily over the last several decades. However, as they increase the THC level, they're leaving the CBD level alone, meaning it's not there to neutralize that THC. So people are using marijuana at extremely high levels of THC. This one is from 2016 and it's at 13%, right? Levels today are at 27%, and in some states you can get it at 42%. So the body's going to release dopamine at a very large quantities. You're not releasing dopamine at 2% THC. Right now, the body is releasing dopamine at 13% THC and above, which can be extremely dangerous. Smoking marijuana releases large amounts of dopamine, more dopamine the body can handle. And depending on how high the THC level is in the marijuana that somebody is smoking, can increase that amount of dopamine. Okay. Using marijuana over long term can lead to an addiction, right? Because it's releasing dopamine. And it can reduce the natural production of dopamine, which we talked about before. When that happens, it can cause that fatigue, lack of motivation, anxiety, mood disorders, and depression. So marijuana's effect on the brain. This slide shows you the areas of the brain in which THC connects. So your body has natural receptors for those cannabinoids, for THC, for CBD, because your body has its own endocannabinoid system, they call it, of the body. So your body releases its own cannabinoids, which is responsible for keeping your body in balance. Homeostasis, that's called. Your endocannabinoid system keeps all the other systems in your body in check. It regulates them. So you have natural receptors for the cannabinoids in marijuana. And if you look on this slide, you will see that it connects to these parts of the brain that is responsible for increasing appetite, for euphoria and relaxation, increased anxiety and paranoia, decreased motor control, impaired learning, altered senses and disordered thinking. Right. So when you talk about the short-term effects, right after like smoking, we see that people can experience a lack of motivation, slowed reaction time, loss of depth perception, bad judgment, irritability, memory problems, lack of concentration, and red eyes. The thing with marijuana, it's fat soluble, okay? Which means that it's not going to pass through the system very quickly like alcohol, which we had talked about previously. Marijuana is going to stay in the system sometimes up to 30 days. So a person's not going to feel high or that euphoria for 30 days. However, right, they can still feel those effects, or such as like learning problems and memory problems, that lack of concentration. Those side effects can linger, especially if somebody is using daily. Right. So some long-term effects of marijuana, it can change the way the brain is functioning, right? It can stop healthy brain development. It can shrink that frontal lobe. And your frontal lobe is responsible for your executive decision making, right? Your ability to make good decisions and reflect and learn from past mistakes. All of that can become affected from long-term marijuana smoking. The respiratory issues from just like smoking cigarettes, and heart issues from the heart being elevated on a constant state of elevation that can cause heart attacks and stroke. It can affect your immune system and your reproductive system. Those cannabinoids will connect into the reproductive areas, which long-term use then can affect a person's ability to have children. Obviously, the cognitive impairments, which we had talked about previously, using long-term, right? Memory problems, those mood disorders from a lack of natural dopamine production, and schizophrenia. This shows you some SPECT scans. A SPECT scan stands for a single photon emission computed tomography. So they use a radioactive material and this specially designed camera to show a three-dimensional image of they can use it on any organ. These are of the brain. So if you look on the brain to the left, it looks smooth, okay? That shows healthy brain development, or healthy brain activity and blood flow throughout the brain. If you look to the slides to the right, these holes are not technically holes, but those holes represent a lack of blood flow and a lack of brain development in those areas, all right? A brain activity in those areas. I like to point out this first one on the top left here is a 16-year-old with a 2-year history of daily use. Okay. So if you compare that to the one right next to it, that's a 38-year-old with 12 years of daily use. There is more like holes or that lack of brain activity and blood flow in the 16-year-old than from the 38-year-old. Right? Again, just to reiterate, to say again that putting any substance into an underdeveloped brain is highly dangerous. It can stop healthy brain development, and addiction is going to happen much quicker. 9 out of 10 people who start using before the age of 18 develop an addiction. With marijuana use, it's 6 out of 10, right? 6 out of 10 people who have an addiction to marijuana started using before they were a teenager. Compare that to an adult starting to use marijuana, it's only 1 in 10. Okay, that brings us to the end of our program. Thank you for listening.